There's often a lot of fuss made about biomechanics and injury prevention, pain, and how they all relate to one another. And yet, there's probably quite a poor correlation between biomechanics and pain. Maybe not quite so much injury, but the pain aspect of it. But if we don't worry about too much about the pain aspect for the minute, and more think of um, the injury side of things, probably the biggest impact on injuries is not the biomechanics, but actually the tissue loading that occurs and how much work you're doing versus the actual way you're doing it. So the higher the training load that you're placing, whether that be intensity of effort or actual sheer volume of training, is much more likely to impact on whether you are setting yourself up for an injury or not. Our tissues are very, very adaptable, and when trained appropriately, we can really avoid a lot of injuries, and quite often injuries are occurring simply because we've exceeded our ability to adapt to the training load that we place on ourselves. So many people, they browse the internet and they want to train like elite athletes, but they forget that they've got a 40-hour a week job, they have two small children, a mortgage to pay, etc., etc., and yet they are training, 6 times a week, doing all sorts of whatever, forgetting that the professional that does that, whilst he may have, the family with two small children, doesn't have a job because his job or her job is being a professional athlete. They are training when they go to work. They are often resting when they're at work, and then they're maybe training again. But they're not doing whatever job it is that you as an athlete are doing and as a recreational athlete are doing, and then trying to fit training sessions in on top of that. The training sessions are their job. So what often people are forgetting to do is take into consideration the stress, and our bodies don't really care where the stress comes from. It's just general stress on us that affects our recovery ability, and factor this into our ability to actually recover from the workouts that we're doing. So one of the things, if you really are looking to avoid, injuring yourself or reducing your chances of injuries, maybe a better way of putting it, then really think about what you're doing in your training and how your job impacts in it, how your family life impacts in it, how well you sleep, how well you eat. All these things come into play in terms of recovery. But more than anything else, with regards to this video, we're thinking more just in terms of how your general stress impacts your training load and your ability to do that. So rather than being too concerned about how perfectly you're executing what you're doing, although having said that, as our training load gets higher, we want to do things as well as we can, since this will allow, moving well will allow you to have a higher training load as you distribute the stress across the tissues better. So the take home from today is, don't get too caught up in biomechanics and them having to be perfect. We've all seen people doing things that we think are kind of crazy, and yet they don't get hurt, or at least they don't get hurt that often. The flip side of that is, you do want to perform your activity well. In the long run, it's the healthier option. It's the one that will give you training longevity. It will help you avoid injuries, but it will also allow you to progress better because, again, an indicator of one of the ways of progressing is how your training load can increase and allowing you to adapt. So think more about how much you're doing rather than how you're doing it, and then think about how you're doing it. so that you can use both sides of it. That we want to move well. If it's deadlift, quite a nice simple, relatively speaking, exercise. Everybody's seen people deadlifting horribly in the gym and yet not getting hurt. But generally speaking, when you look at what they're doing, they're not lifting a lot, so their load isn't that high, and then they can get away with it. It doesn't matter too much. But as the training load increases, there is a requirement for their form to improve to ensure that we distribute the stress better and allow more efficient movement, so that we get less movement through the spine. Say we're able to keep ourselves in that neutral zone, which isn't neutral, but like I say, a zone where there is some play, rather than often you'll see people where as soon as they start lifting, their spine flexes terribly, rather than maintaining it within a nice sort of, let's say, zone that is generally quite an efficient place to move. And if you're able to do that, you can increase your training load, but you're increasing your training load in a safe manner that allows you to adapt because of how you're then placing the stress on the tissues that you're working.